Story 1. In the fall of 2011, a lighthouse keeper on the Maine coast vanished during a storm, leaving the light burning and his dinner still warm on the stove. What investigators found in the weeks that followed would turn a quiet fishing village into the center of one of the strangest missing person cases the state had ever seen. The town of Amity Cove sat at the edge of a narrow peninsula, the kind of place where the fog rolled in so thick by late afternoon that streetlights switched on before 4. Its economy ran on lobster boats and tourists, chasing photographs of the old Black Point Light, a squat white tower that had guided ships past the rocks since 1889. For the last 11 years, its keeper had been a quiet man named Everett Cole, 53, a widower who'd taken the job after his wife passed and never left. Locals said Everett talked to the light more than he talked to people. He kept the lens polished, the logbook current, and the gulls fed from a coffee can on the rail. Everett hadn't always been a solitary man. Before his wife Doreen died, the two of them ran a small bait and tackle shop on the harbor, the kind of place where fishermen lingered over coffee long after their gear was paid for. Doreen had been the warmth of that partnership, and when the cancer took her in the winter of 2000, Everett sold the shop within the month and applied for the keeper's position at Black Point. A job that hadn't technically needed a live-in keeper since the light was automated in the 80s, but the Coast Guard kept a caretaker on the property anyway for maintenance and to satisfy the historical society that ran tours in the summer. Everett got the post more out of pity than necessity, and everyone in town understood that, and no one ever said it to his face. For a while, the arrangement suited him. He kept to a rigid schedule, up before dawn to check the lens, down to the rocks at low tide to gather driftwood, dinner at 6 sharp. Logbook entries written in the same careful hand every night, regardless of whether anything had happened. Visitors on the summer tours remembered him as pleasant if quiet, willing to answer questions about the light's history, but never volunteering much about himself. He fed the gulls from an old coffee can kept just inside the tower door, a habit that had gone on so long the birds recognized the sound of the door hinge and would circle down before he'd even stepped outside. On the night of October 3rd, a nor'easter rolled in off the Atlantic, with wind gusts strong enough to strip shingles off the harbor bait shop. The Coast Guard station across the cove logged the light functioning normally at 9 p.m. At 6 a.m. The next morning, when the storm had passed, a supply boat captain named Denny Ruiz came out to drop off groceries. Same as every Tuesday. He knocked. No answer. The door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, but the state of the kitchen was. A pot of stew sat on the stove, cold, a spoon still standing upright in it. Everett's boots were by the door. His coat was on its hook. And Everett Cole was nowhere in the building. Denny radioed it in, and by mid-morning, county deputies and 2 Coast Guard officers had combed every room of the tower, from the oil room at the base to the lamp room at the top. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, no forced entry. The only thing out of place was the logbook. Everett's final entry, written in his usual steady hand, simply read, "Light holding something at the rocks." The search. Sheriff Dale Kinnick, a broad, unhurried man who'd run the county for going on 9 years, arrived at the lighthouse by early afternoon. He'd known Everett since grade school, had eaten his stew more than once during winter patrols. Standing in the empty kitchen, Kinnick later told a deputy it felt less like a crime scene and more like Everett had simply been lifted out of his own life mid-sentence. Search teams fanned across the peninsula. Divers went into the cove, despite the churn still left over from the storm, working the rocks below the tower, where a man could easily have been swept in by wind and waves. They found nothing. No body washed ashore in the days that followed, no clothing snagged on the rocks, nothing the tide dragged in. The lighthouse's small rowboat was still chained at the dock, untouched. If Everett Cole had gone into the water, the ocean had taken him without leaving so much as a footprint. Helicopters from the state police swept the bluffs for 2 full days. their spotlights raking across the scrubgrass and granite outcrops that ringed the peninsula. Cadaver dogs were brought out from as far as Bangor, handlers walking them along every trail that led toward the tower. The dogs, according to two separate handlers, refused to approach the north rail of the lighthouse gallery, sitting down abruptly at the base of the stairs and refusing every command to climb further. One handler wrote it off as the wind off the water unsettling the animals. The other, an older man who'd worked search and rescue for over 20 years, told Kinnick privately that he'd never seen a dog do that before. Not once. Not for any reason he could explain. The note in the logbook became the center of everything. Something at the rocks. Deputies pressed Denny Ruiz and the handful of fishermen who worked those waters, asking if anyone had seen debris, a boat in distress, anything. One young lobsterman, Cody Fenn, said he'd noticed odd shapes bobbing near Black Point's rocks 2 nights before the storm, but he'd written it off as driftwood catching the light strange. He hadn't thought much of it until now. The keeper's habits. Kinnick pulled Everett's logbooks going back 3 years, looking for any pattern that might explain the entry. Most nights were unremarkable. Weather, ship traffic, gull counts, the occasional passing note about loneliness, dressed up as small talk with himself. But scattered through the last 4 months were entries that stood out. Lights on the water again, not boats. Something singing past the breakwater. Low. Wrong key. Gulls won't land on the north rail anymore. Kinnick had assumed, reading them the first time, that Everett was simply an old man growing strange in his solitude. Now, he wasn't so sure. Further back in the logs, an entry from July read, "Counted the gulls tonight out of habit. 11, same as always." Except there were 12 shadows on the rail. Another, from August, read only, "Doreen used to say, 'The light hums when it's tired.' I used to think that was just her being fanciful. Tonight, I heard it too." Deputies flagged a dozen more entries like these, spread out with no discernible pattern, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes 2 nights running. None of them had alarmed Everett enough to call anyone. He simply wrote them down and kept polishing the lens. A widow down the road, Marge Whitfield, who'd known Everett for decades, told deputies he'd called her twice in September, agitated in a way she'd never heard from him. "He said the rocks were getting closer to the tower," she said. "Not literally," he told me, "like they were watching him get closer." Gee. To this day, Black Point Light still stands, automated now, its lens turning on a timer with no keeper to tend it. Fishermen still work the water below it, though most give the rocks a wider berth than the charts require. And on foggy nights, when the wind drops just right, some swear they can still hear something moving along the breakwater, patient, unhurried, waiting for whoever gets close enough to watch it back.
Instead, she'd chalked it up to his age and his isolation. Now she couldn't stop turning the phrase over in her mind. Marge wasn't the only one Everett had reached out to. The Historical Society director who ran the summer tours, a soft-spoken retiree named Paul Ostrander, said Everett had asked him an odd question in early September, whether the society had records of any keeper before him ever leaving the post suddenly, without notice, without a forwarding address. Paul had laughed it off at the time, telling Everett that lighthouse keepers had a reputation for eccentricity going back 100 years and it didn't mean much. Everett hadn't laughed back. He'd simply nodded and changed the subject, and Paul hadn't thought about the exchange again until the day Everett went missing. The second disappearance. 3 weeks into the search, with no trace of Everett found, Cody Fenn, the young lobsterman who'd mentioned the strange shapes near the rocks, went out alone before dawn to check his traps. Same as always, his boat was found drifting empty off Black Point Light that afternoon, engine still idling, running lights still on. His traps were untouched in the hold, his radio sat off the hook, as though he'd been mid-conversation. Cody's father, a lobsterman himself for 30 years, told deputies his son had been unusually quiet in the days before he vanished. He'd mentioned once, almost in passing, that he kept hearing something under the water when he cut his engine near the rocks. A low tone he couldn't place. Not a buoy bell, not a seal, something underneath the hull that seemed to rise and fall with his own breathing. His father had told him to stop drinking before his morning runs. Cody had laughed and let the subject drop. The town, already unsettled, tipped fully into fear. 2 men gone from the same stretch of water inside a month, both vanishing without a scrap of physical evidence, both leaving behind machines still humming as if nothing had happened. Kinnick doubled the search radius, brought in state police divers with better equipment, and started keeping his own private notes alongside the official file, notes he didn't show anyone. Sightings begin. The first report came from a woman walking her dog along the bluff above the lighthouse at dusk. She said she saw a tall shape standing at the base of the tower, motionless, facing the water. When she called out, thinking it might be a deputy, the figure didn't turn, didn't answer. By the time she'd gotten close enough to see clearly, there was nothing there at all, just wet rock and the gulls scattering off the rail. A trucker delivering fuel to the harbor 2 nights later swore he saw someone standing waist-deep in the surf below the tower in the middle of the night, unmoving, arms loose at their sides, water breaking around them without so much as a ripple of resistance. He didn't stop. He told Kinnick later he didn't want to know what would happen if he did. A third witness, a teenage boy out past curfew with friends, described something similar from a distance, though he added a detail the earlier witnesses hadn't mentioned. He said the figure's outline seemed to bend slightly with the wind, the way a sheet on a clothesline might, as though whatever it was wore something loose that moved independently of a body underneath. His friends backed up the sighting but admitted they hadn't looked long. They'd run. Then came the recording. A birdwatcher with audio equipment set up near the point to catch gull calls picked up something else entirely on the night tape, a low tone, almost a hum, rising and falling beneath the wind. And beneath that, if you slowed it down, what sounded like a voice repeating a single phrase. When the state lab cleaned the audio, 2 words came through clean enough to transcribe. Come closer. The lab technician who handled the file, a woman named Priya Anand, later told Kinnick she'd run the audio through 3 separate noise filters, trying to prove it was wind shear or a mechanical artifact from the recorder itself. Each time, the phrase held steady, the same 2 words, the same flat cadence, never distorting no matter how she isolated the frequency. She told him she didn't sleep well for a week after that and asked, only half joking, whether the department had another audio expert she could hand the file to instead. The historical thread, digging through the county archive for any precedent. A records clerk stumbled on something that had been buried in a filing cabinet since the 1950s. In November of 1954, the keeper of Black Point Light at the time, a man named Silas Trent, had vanished under nearly identical circumstances. Log entry ending mid-sentence. Dinner left on the stove. No sign of struggle. No body ever recovered. The case had been written off at the time as a man simply walking into the sea, a common enough verdict for isolated keepers in that era, and the file had gathered dust for almost 60 years. Kinnick drove to the County Historical Society himself to review what remained of Silas Trent's personal effects, most of it donated by a niece decades earlier who'd wanted nothing to do with the lighthouse or its contents. Among the water-damaged papers was a partial diary, most of its pages illegible, but a handful of surviving entries near the end read eerily close to Everett's own. The gulls have stopped coming to the rail. Something under the water keeps time with my heartbeat. And on what appeared to be the final page, water-stained but legible, it isn't the light it wants. Doreen was wrong about that too. Kinnick stared at that last line for a long time. He hadn't told anyone in the Historical Society that Doreen was also the name of Everett's late wife. It was, as far as anyone could determine, an extraordinary coincidence, and Kinnick tried to file it that way in his official report. Privately, in his own notebook, he wrote only, same name, 60 years apart. Coincidence doesn't sit right in my stomach the way it should. The forensic re-examination, with the historical parallel now part of the case file, state investigators returned to the tower for a second sweep, this time focused less on the interior and more on the rocks themselves. A geologist brought in to examine the shoreline noted something strange about the tide pools directly below the north rail, a faint, persistent discoloration in the standing water, almost oily, that didn't match any known algae bloom or fuel spill. Samples sent to a state lab came back inconclusive. The compound unidentifiable, its molecular structure, in the words of the report, organic in origin but consistent with nothing in our reference database. Divers returned to that same stretch of water 3 separate times over the following month, and each time reported the same unsettling detail. Visibility dropped to almost nothing within a few feet of the rocks. Even on calm, clear days when the rest of the cove was visible for yards in every direction, one diver, surfacing early from his second attempt, told Kinnick he'd felt something brush against his ankle in water he could have sworn was empty, and that he wasn't going back down a third time no matter what the department was paying. Kinnick's obsession. The sheriff began driving out to Black Point Light alone after his shifts ended, standing at the same spot in the kitchen where Everett's stew had gone cold, staring out at the water until the last of the daylight burned off. His deputies noticed the change in him before he'd admitted himself, the shadows under his eyes, the way he stopped finishing sentences, the private notebook he carried everywhere and wouldn't let anyone read. His wife, Ellen, noticed too. She told a deputy's spouse, in confidence, that Dale had started sleeping with the bedroom light on for the first time in the 30 years she'd known him, and that he'd taken to standing at their own back window some nights, staring out at nothing in particular, though their house was nowhere near the water. When she asked him what he was looking for, he told her he didn't know yet, and that answer frightened her more than if he'd simply refused to talk about it at all. One night, alone at the tower, Kinnick recorded a note into his phone that his deputy would find weeks later. His voice on the recording is steady at first. Everett wasn't confused. He wrote exactly what he saw. Something at the rocks. Not someone. Something. Then a long pause. Wind hissing across the mic. Then, quieter. I think it's been coming closer for years. I think it started with the gulls. In that same recording, recovered later and played back at a low volume in the sheriff's office, there's a stretch near the end where Kinnick's voice drops to almost nothing, and underneath it, faint but present, is the same low tone the Birdwatchers tape had captured weeks earlier. Priya Anand, asked to compare the two recordings, confirmed the frequency matched within a fraction of a hertz, a level of consistency she said she couldn't explain by coincidence or ambient noise alone. The town divides. As the weeks wore on with no bodies recovered and no suspects named, Amity Cove split into two uneasy camps. Some residents pushed for the state to simply decommission the lighthouse property altogether, fence it off, and let the Historical Society mourn the loss of its tours. Others, mostly the older fishing families who'd worked those waters longest, grew quietly insistent that nothing be disturbed further, that whatever was out past the breakwater ought to be left alone rather than provoked with more divers, more lights, more questions. A town meeting called to discuss funding for an expanded search turned into a shouting match between the two factions, and Kinnick, standing at the back of the room, said nothing the entire time, which unsettled people almost as much as anything else that fall. The final night. On the anniversary of the nor'easter, almost to the hour, dispatch lost radio contact with Kinnick's cruiser. It was found the next morning parked at the turnout above Black Point Light, engine running, driver's door open, his hat resting on the seat exactly the way a driver's cap might be left on a dashboard, the kind of small, deliberate detail that decades of local ghost stories would later borrow from without ever getting quite right. Kinnick was gone. His notebook was recovered from the glove box. The last entry, written in a hand far less steady than his usual clean print, read, "It doesn't want the light. It wants whoever's watching it." Beneath that, nothing but a long unbroken line, as though the pen had simply kept moving after the thought behind it had stopped. The cruiser's dash camera, when deputies finally reviewed the footage, showed almost nothing usable for the first 20 minutes. Just Kinnick's cruiser idling at the turnout in heavy fog, headlights barely cutting more than a few feet ahead. Then his door can be heard opening, his footsteps crunching against gravel, fading toward the tower. For nearly 10 minutes after that, the camera captures only fog and the sound of the surf. Then, faintly, a second set of footsteps, slower, heavier, moving past the cruiser from the opposite direction, toward the water. The recording ends abruptly in a burst of static, and when the picture returns, the turnout is empty, the fog thinning, dawn just beginning to break over the tower. Deputy Carla Reyes, who'd worked under Kinnick for 6 years, took over the department in the weeks that followed, though several of her colleagues quietly transferred to neighboring counties rather than continue rotating patrols past Black Point after dark. Reyes kept the case open officially, though she stopped scheduling night patrols out to the point entirely, a decision she never explained in writing.